Hi, it's Dr. Parikh, and today we're talking about the discussion section. I'll warn you, the scheduling might change a little bit from what you're seeing on the screen because I'm trying out a new way to try to spread things a little more evenly so there's more time to work on assignments in the beginning than there used to be and less time at the end. I'm a little anxious about how that's all going to work out, but I think it's going to be an improvement. But I may tinker with it. If all I'm doing is changing the date slightly, I'm probably not going to bother to update this video. If I change the assignment, like how many articles you're supposed to do or things like that, then I'm going to go in and update the videos. So just as a warning, the dates and the, how things spread out might look a little different. So you can see let me bring this back up. The paper, I have you do a little bit out of order because with writing, we often freeze up, especially when we're not sure what we're doing. So my mantra is do the easy stuff first. When it comes to article notes, start with the article you feel like you understand the most and that's easiest to read. So when it comes to the paper, start with the sections that that seem the most straightforward, because I think momentum is really important as a writer. And so just getting moving on things is so helpful. And I find the discussion section to be easier. I also find that the discussion section takes the least planning as far as understanding how you're going to tie your articles together. So if you're still struggling with the concept map and how you want to organize things, you can jump into the main section of the discussion. So in Blackboard, the discussion section comes first. If you look at the templates, I do still have the literature review themes section outlined first. That's the order the paper comes in. The introduction or literature review section is before the discussion. But I have you start with the discussion section. So I'm going to have my template up. Again, yours might look slightly differently because if I'm just clarifying things or adding, tweaking things, I'm not going to bother redoing the whole video. So your outline discussion, again, there's a lot of things written in here, and that is just to help you. I try to make the video as if you're not going to read the template, and the template as if you're not going to watch the video. Now, I do sometimes after I make the video, I'll look at the template and say, oh, I can't believe I forgot to say that. So I do think you should do both, but I'm going to ignore it for the most part. Remember, outlines, don't get any quotes. This is all your work, because I want to make sure that you have the skills you need to do this kind of writing, to do the paper. And so these outlines, another thing I'll mention, I'm not going to look at the drafts of your paper unless you schedule an office hours visit. Because here in the outline, you are essentially putting the main sections of your paper. When you write your rough draft, you're really just stringing these together, doing the formatting, and starting to smooth things over, make sure things make sense as whole paragraphs, stuff like that. So your peers are going to give you feedback on your draft, but I'm really just going to look at the final paper. Like everything else, or like most assignments, the outline is a one-shot deal. So you do your best, you submit it, I give you feedback. You don't resubmit it. You take the feedback and you use it for future, for your final paper. And that final paper, I don't look at a draft, but a big chunk of that paper will directly plug into your final research proposal paper. And so the feedback I give on that section, you can revise. And the discussion section that we're doing here, you're not going to use that same section in your research proposal, but you'll use the skills for how to do the sections. This class is about building skills, not building a perfect paper. And it's about learning the process of revision and making each step a little better. On the bright side, you're going to get more points on this assignment if you take my feedback and your peers' feedback and your tutor's feedback from previous steps. So your article notes, you're going to copy and paste some ideas from there into here. Maybe I should take that back. Your literature review themes outline, you're going to copy and paste a lot. So let's jump into the discussion. Friendly reminder, this is a newer format that I'm using. I'm recording summer 2019. Spring 2019, students were still using the old format where it went limitations, professional applications, future research. I'm not sure why I was ordering it that way. My guess is that somebody before me did, or, I had a reason. But it was always confusing to students that you would switch gears and then switch back. So now I'm making one heading that says limitations in future research. So you'll have one paragraph with limitations, one paragraph with future research, no heading in between. You're still focusing the two paragraphs on those different but related topics, but you don't need to jump around sections. And then there's one section on professional applications. When you look at your paper, overall paper template, there is a buffer paragraph that goes before your limitations that is what I call sort of the summary paragraph, the discussion summary, which is where you take a breath and you review the main thesis, the main purpose of the paper. When you are doing research, you review the main findings. I don't include that here because the whole point of doing this section first is that you don't have to have your outline planned out. And a summary paragraph, all of your summary paragraphs, so your abstract, your roadmap, your discussion summary, and your conclusion, those should all be some of the last things you write because you want to make sure that it reflects the final layout of your paper. You can change things around quite dramatically based on my feedback or peers' feedback. Also, so that there's a sense of consistency. You can make sure that you are highlighting the same main points, and you can also make sure you're being balanced and not just repeating the same language. So thinking about, okay, how do I want to emphasize the conclusion, is a little more of a take-home message. And the discussion summary is a little more of a heart-to-heart on what was the point of all this? What do I want you to remember? So we jump right into the limitations here. So when you're doing it yourself, you can just delete all this extra stuff if you want. Again, I wrote all this for a purpose. I encourage you to read it, but you don't need to include it. So the first thing you'll do is a topic sentence. And I would suggest looking at 2 or 3 different sample papers to get ideas of what kinds of topic sentences. It can be really broad, like this study had several limitations. Like that's fine. It's super bland, but it's fine. You could also say something like these studies had several limitations related to, and then give broad descriptors to the sample and the survey methods. So you might critique, maybe there's not enough racial diversity. Maybe it's about relationships, but they did not include any LGBT individuals. So thinking about who's being left out of the sample, or if all 3 studies happen in the US, that's an important thing to recognize because, again, our bias, it's like my glasses. I don't notice my frames anymore. They're just always part of my field of vision, and so I don't notice them until someone draws my attention to what I'm not, what's just always there. So it's important to recognize that it's a limitation to have all of your research in one place, even if it's the place where you are. It's still important to recognize, let's say we have an immigrant from somewhere else that we're working with. Even if I'm practicing in New Jersey, whatever, whether I'm a nurse, a counselor, a school counselor, a lawyer, whatever I'm doing that's interacting with the public, let's say I'm working with trauma victims, and so I'm reading research on PTSD to be more competent in my practice. If all of the research is focused on the US, and especially on majority white samples, and I have immigrants or refugees from other places that I'm working with, that research might not apply to them. That's a big thing to recognize, to say, look, we don't always, sometimes different cultural groups respond differently to a lot of things. And so it's important to recognize who's being represented in the work that's being done. So you'll start with a topic sentence, and actually, I put the topic sentence first because that's what's logical when you're writing, but I recommend doing the topic sentence last too, because your topic sentence, when I'm just flowing, writing, not really paying attention, the last sentence of my paragraph is often an excellent topic sentence because that's where I summarize the main points. You're not putting together, A, then B, then C, so ta-da, this is what it means. That's really tough for a reader to follow. As a reader, it's much easier to say, here's my claim, and now here's all the evidence with citations to back that up. In this case, you're just sort of saying generally what was wrong with wrong is a harsh word. What is limiting about these studies? What can't these studies tell us? So for each limitation, you're going to have 1 or 2 sentences, and you're not going to say they should have included more women. Just say they did, their sample represented or was biased toward men. Or, you could just say did not include enough, or I'm sorry, I may have fudged that a little. You don't, yeah, you wouldn't say they should have included more women. Instead, you would just say they did not include enough women, or they oversampled men, they included more men than women. Because when you get into should, for one, I don't want you to use the word should in here. It's a very sort of judgy word. But when you're talking about what you wish they had done instead, that goes down in future research. And you don't say they should. You just say future research can or may do such and such. Part of scientific writing is that we try, we try to be very like almost zen. We try to say things without judgment, without commands. It just is what it is. Future research can do this. And you'll notice variety. Sometimes there is more oomph to writing in science, but I want you to know, I at least want you to be able to write in a neutral way. And later, if you choose to write your, if you become an academic and publish research, if you choose to do it with more oomph, I want that to be a conscious decision for specific reasons. Also, you want to focus on scholarly statements. So not, I found this table confusing, or it was hard to read. You just want to focus on methodology. What was the merits scientifically of the research? Participants is the easiest place to poke those holes. Again, race, country, gender, and think of what's logical. Because, it's too burdensome for every study to measure every facet of diversity. But again, if it's a study that focuses on relationships, you should be seeing reports of sexual orientation and potentially gender identity that includes representation of trans individuals. And if you don't, even if it's just not reported, you can critique that this study did not report sexual orientation. Things in relationships get a little funny too, because sometimes they only include married individuals. And so you could say, well, that's not, it's not wrong to focus on married individuals, but if you're saying relationships and then only measuring married individuals, you're not measuring what you're saying you're measuring. You need to be very clear if your population is people who are legally married versus people who are in a long-term committed relationship that you can marry. A lot of times cohabitating is a way that's assessed. It's just important to make sure that they're measuring what they're saying they're measuring. So the easiest way to find limitations is to look at participants, look at who's being included. More advanced ways include things like whether the measures are appropriate, whether, was this measure really designed to do this thing, whether the measures have psychometric validity and reliability. So psychometric just means like a measure that we use for psychological things. So like an intelligence test, a depression screening, a personality assessment. Those are all psychometric measures. And so when we think about validity, is it measuring what they're saying it's measuring? And reliability is, does it measure the same way every time? It's tough to have validity without reliability, but you could have something that's consistent but inaccurate. In the past, I think I've given the example of using foot size to measure reading ability. And for a certain population, if you look at certain sections of the population, especially grade school, then foot size actually is a somewhat decent measure of reading ability. But if you look among adults, it's probably going to be nothing. So you can have, that's an extreme example, but you can have measures that seem okay until you put pressure on them and really start exploring. So you could critique those, but for this level of course, I'm not expecting that. What you might do is critique variables that got left out. So again, my example of, if they're doing relationships, but they're not asking about people's sexual orientation or gender identity, including trans individuals, you could say this is a variable that really is important and was left out. Also, let's say you have two articles that included that included two variables. So let's say for depression, we're looking at the effects of exercise on depression. I'm just making this up as we go. So we're looking at exercise on depression, and two of the studies included a measure of stress, and that measure seems to be pretty important, that variable. And the third study did exercise and depression but didn't measure stress. You could critique that third study left out an important variable, and so now we're not sure. Maybe if we had considered that variable, we would have found something different. So maybe exercise helps with depression, but only for high stress or only for low stress. I don't know that this is a thing. I'm just making up an example. And so you could say, well, these findings may have come out differently if you had considered this other variable. So that's one that you may be able to do at your level of training at this point. But if you have 3 limitations all related to critiquing the participants, that's enough for me right now. By the time you get to experimental psychology, your professors are probably going to want you to have a little more nuanced critiques. But for me, for now, I'm good with you just doing participants. So limitations and future research should, there I'm using the word should, I'm noticing, I want them to be connected. So let's say limitation, so you have 3 limitations, and then I only make you do 2 future research. So that's down enough that we can see everything at once. So you'll choose 3 different limitations, and I do want to see a mix of different, I want to see 3 different articles being cited here. So you're going to pick at least 2. You could do all 3. It's fine. More is always okay. Less, that's going to hurt a little. But you choose at least 2 of your limitations and talk about what future research can do. If you want to talk about other ideas, just add in limitations. I want to see a match. I want to see that you can identify that future research is building on the limits of current research. So it could be, and you could add a limitation. None of these studies looked at this potentially interesting variable. And then your future research would be future work can look at this interesting variable. So I'm fine with, I'm open. So I want at least 3 pretty concrete limitations, at least 2 future research. You can always add more as long as anything that's in future research, I also want to see in limitations. Professional applications. This section is often one of the most difficult of the discussion for students to really get what you're supposed to do. So I want to talk a little bit about what journals are. Journals are publications. They're not magazines. They are very expensive. Usually you have to have a membership to an organization or have an affiliation with a library to get them. And so it's not something that people are in the public are going to read for fun. Like Psychology Today, that's a magazine that some people might get just for fun. Or there's like Parents Magazine that would have some developmental psych information in it. This is not that. These are things being read by people who are reading this as part of their job. So it may be nurses, doctors, counseling, for psych, it's going to be a lot of counselors, occupational therapists, maybe teachers if you were to publish in an educational journal. So you want to think about who are professionals who would be working with individuals affected by what you're discussing. And for this, you could even broaden it to talk about people like law enforcement or even lawmakers. So for my dissertation, I was talking about college students' peer support for grieving friends, especially for first and second year students living on campus, because those are people who are typically away from their family and, younger than older college students. And so when I wrote this section for my dissertation, and when I wrote earlier stuff to be published, I focus not just on counselors, but also on people like residence life or college student or college administrators. So who are working with students. One of the things I found was that students were less, one of the things that could hold students back, a barrier to offering support, was not knowing where there's a quiet, private place to have that kind of conversation. And I thought back to my experience and I thought, yeah, I happened to live in a dorm where there were lots of little study rooms and there was an attached academic wing that you could swipe into. So you could even go into one of the classrooms, or there was just space in my hall, but not all halls had that. And so an administrator who's deciding how to create this, a residence hall might want to have that kind of information to think about, okay, it's important to have space for support to happen. So professional applications, I'm very open to who you include as professionals. Often pediatricians or nurses get included for work with kids, teachers, school counselors, people like that. Most papers that get written here can, you can address one or both things to therapists. You can choose two different professionals, or you can have different advice for different professionals. Make sure that whatever you do, the two different applications are distinct. So if it's the same person, you need to very clearly have two different ideas you're giving for how the person might use the work. If it's different people, you can't just say, school counselors can, again, avoid should, school counselors can do depression screenings with kids who recently had a major medical issue, let's say. You can't go on and say family therapists should do depression screenings with kids who have recently had a major medical issue. Like, that's exactly the same thing, just to a different professional. You might, however, say family professionals can train parents on identifying, or family therapists can train parents on identifying early symptoms of depression in children who have recently had major medical issues. That's a different thing. That also addresses another issue. Don't write these to parents or to clients. They're not reading papers like this. I know nobody's reading your paper except me and you and your peers, but when you publish, the whole point is I'm training you how to write the way you would write if you're publishing. And when you publish, you're publishing for other professionals. So instead of saying, just telling, parents can do this, instead talk about how the professional interacting, even a nurse or a pediatrician, might go over, okay, here are the things to watch for. Here are some basic warning signs for depression in children. For example, with depression and anxiety, kids often, a kid won't say I'm feeling anxious. They'll say my stomach hurts or I have a headache. And with depression, they may be angry rather than sad in their behavior. So you could focus on what would the professional tell the parent. Now, another important thing with these is, let's say you're writing about depression, and in your professional applications, you say professionals should do suicide assessments with all clients. Now, that's something I agree with, and if the focus of your paper wasn't on suicide, it's not appropriate for your paper. So it's not just that it's true and accurate, it's also that it's relevant to your main points. Now, at this point, you may not know exactly how everything's going to fit together, but you should have a sense of what your main points are going to be, what the main ideas are. So you should be able to write a pretty good professional application section, and you can always revise it if let's say you talk about suicide assessment and then you end up completely ignoring the couple suicide citations that you were going to use. You would have to update the professional applications to match that. Let's see. So again, everything needs a topic sentence. I have you write it now because, so this outline is going to take you a while because you're essentially writing your paper. But once you sit down to draft your paper, it's going to go very quickly. You're almost, within half an hour, you'll be more in an editing mode than a writing mode. That takes us to the end of the template. Let's pop over. So again, you're going to make a PDF or a doc file. You're going to upload it. You can look at the rubric, and the outlines are worth 30 points each. That's a decent chunk. That's 3% of your final grade. It's a decent chunk compared to some of the other assignments. And you can always look in and see how things are assessed. And the outlines I tend to do pretty generously. So for example, full credit is 5%. So half credit would be 2.5%, but I've actually given you 3.5% for being partly complete. For having anything like you did it, but you did it completely wrong, that would be half credit. So I'm very generous in the scoring at this point. That means a couple things. For one, the final paper has most of these same, tick boxes in them, but the scoring is more where the middle would be 50% and this column, second to the, something more than 0 would be more like 25%, which would be 1.25% of the final grade in this case. So the grading, the penalties go up. So the mistake, if you look at a mistake and you say, it only cost me half a point here, it might cost you less later, but it might also cost you more. The other thing is, if you see that I only got 2 points off out of 30, I did really well, I'll just, I'm not going to bother looking at it, that's going to bite you. Because for one, I'm going to be annoyed because I'm like, I gave feedback and absolutely nothing changed. But also, again, 2 points off might be a lot of errors because of how generously I've got the rubric set up. So small point deductions, really this rubric for me is set up more for the early projects. It's more about feedback than about, awarding appropriate grades. I mean, your points do factor in, but really the rubric is set up to be specific enough that I can give you feedback by just clicking a few boxes and let you know what sections are good and what sections you need to go back and work on. If you do notice you've lost points and you're not sure why, so you can email me, but you want to be specific. So instead of saying, why did I lose points on this assignment? So I'm going to be so annoyed if I get an email like that. Because what you're asking me to do is to go onto my computer, look up, come into our Blackboard, look at your specific assignment, look over all the feedback I gave, and give you a detailed rundown of everything that's wrong with it. That could easily take me half an hour to an hour. If I had that kind of time, I would have done it in the first place. But I've just got too many students to do that kind of individual feedback every single time. If you have a question about a section, email me, but say something, for example, if limitations 1, you got half, this limitation is clear but not appropriate. If you don't understand that feedback, you could email me and say, limitations 1, I got this feedback. Here, I copied and pasted my limitation. I'm not sure what's wrong with it. That's a totally different email for me because I can just look at it and I can say, okay, here's what's wrong. Here's, an idea or two for how you can fix it. Now, if you do that for 10 mistakes in a paper, I'm going to tell you this is unmanageable for me. You need to come meet with me. But I talk about this because I really want to make it clear to students how to get the best feedback. If you have small questions, email is great, and I encourage you to reach out to me. If you feel lost and you really need to be walked through the assignment, for one, if that happens over and over, you may want to consider not continuing with the online course. This video may come a little late for that. But also, if it's just one assignment or 2 assignments that's really got you lost, come and meet with me, whether it's office hours or making another appointment for in-person or doing video chat, either during office hours times or during a special time. So if you're feeling lost and you need more feedback than what you're getting from your peers and from these rubrics, and I usually include a couple comments, reach out and we can figure out the best way to get it. Let me see if there's anything else I need to tell you. Nope. This assignment is going to feel hard because it's a lot of the work of writing your paper. But you're going to get through it and you're going to be excited about what you've done. Thanks. Bye.